What's up, everybody? I'm Pastor Jeff. Welcome back to Thursday's Theology. Man, oh man, am I excited for this week's episode. The last 2 weeks, we've talked about the worst movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But this week, we get to go to the other end of the spectrum and talk about one of the best Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Oh my goodness. This is a fantastic movie for several reasons. But unfortunately, I don't have enough time to talk about all the high points of this movie. So I'll summarize it with this. This movie is so good. There are so many different angles I could take with Captain America, but I want to focus specifically on his own character. There are also several theologies that we could go off on it with Captain America's character, but I want to focus on how Captain America himself embodies the role that many of the Old Testament prophets did. Once again, I'm Pastor Jeff. Let's dive in. Like I said in the intro, there are so many theological angles that we could take with Captain America, but one of the most interesting, I think, is the idea of Captain America as a prophet. Now, hear me out. One of the plot lines in The Winter Soldier is that Steve Rogers wakes up from his frozen coma and is coming to grips with the reality that he finds himself in. Not only is it a different world that Captain America wakes up to, but it is a world that is much more complicated than the one he left. Now, the moral compass that Cap had used during the 30s and 40s no longer has an accurate bearing on the world around him. The enemies are more complex. America's rationale for pursuing those enemies is morally questionable. This is not the world that Cap left behind. Now, as Steve Rogers struggles to come to terms with this new reality, he defaults to the only thing that he has known, following orders from his superiors. When he is given the assignment to hunt down the assassin known as the Winter Soldier, he accepts the mission as a means to return to the moral compass he once used. But once again, the world is more complicated than when he left it. Once Captain America learns that the assassin is actually his childhood best friend that has been brainwashed, Steve realizes that he cannot complete his mission. Now, let me pause here and say that if it is a surprise to you that the Winter Soldier is Bucky Barnes, go see the movie. It's been long enough already. Come on. I'm not even going to say spoiler alert because you should have seen this movie by now. But anyway, back to what we were talking about. Captain America's relationship with Bucky Barnes is more important to him than completing his mission. Now, once Cap chooses to spare Bucky, he is labeled a traitor and is pursued by S.H.I.E.L.D. as an enemy of the state. Now, here's where I think that Captain America's story parallels Old Testament prophets. Prophets were individuals in the Old Testament that would speak the truth of God's word to kings and warriors. They were often sought out by the Israelite kings to help predict the outcome of a particular battle. In other words, prophets were extremely influential figures in Israelite history. But their prophetic words were not always greeted with acceptance. In fact, prophets were more often rebuked and ignored because they would deliver messages of defeat or judgment from God to the kings. For instance, we have a story in the book of 1 Kings that illustrates the role of prophets. Basically, what is happening in 1 Kings chapter 22 is that King Jehoshaphat is getting ready to go into battle against Ramoth-Gilead. But he wants to make sure that God is on his side, so he gathers together about 400 prophets and asks them whether or not he should go into battle. Now, as a quick side note, not all prophets spoke God's truth. In fact, there were more false prophets in Israel than true prophets. But that's another episode entirely. So the 400 that Jehoshaphat gathers are what are called yes men. They will not disagree with the king at all. So after gathering these 400 yes men, Jehoshaphat asks them if he should ride into battle. The 400 reply with this. They say, "Go, the Lord will give it, Ramoth-Gilead, into the king's hand." But Jehoshaphat is not convinced by this, so this is his response that he says. This is in verses 7 and 8 of 1 Kings 22. It says, "But Jehoshaphat asked, 'Is there no longer a prophet of the Lord here whom we can inquire of?' The king of Israel answered Jehoshaphat, 'There is still one prophet through whom we can inquire of the Lord. But I hate him, because he never prophesies anything good about me, but always bad. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah.'" Micaiah had a reputation of prophesying against the leaders of Israel, but Micaiah was speaking the truth of God. The dynamic here is that Micaiah was viewed as hostile towards the king and Israel because he remained true to the message God had given him to speak. This is why I think Captain America's story reflects a similar dynamic. Steve Rogers woke up to a world where his morality was thrown into question, but when it came to the truth of the Winter Soldier's identity, he could not follow through with his orders. In other words, what is happening is that Captain America was like the prophets of the Old Testament, where they were only seen as heroes as long as they remained loyal to the crown. But as soon as they spoke against the king, they were labeled as hostiles. Micaiah is the perfect example of this because he, quote, never prophesies anything good. Captain America was labeled a traitor as soon as he spoke and acted against his orders. And that, for me, is how Captain America the Winter Soldier highlights the dynamic many of the Old Testament prophets faced with the kings of Israel. And there you have it. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of Thursday's Theology. If you want your weekly dose of theology, make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you missed last week's episode of Thursday's Theology, click here to watch it. If you want to find out more about theology in general, make sure to go over to thursdaystheology.com to find out more. As always, I'm Pastor Jeff. Thanks for joining me. And remember, theology doesn't always have to be difficult. It is simply the study of who God is. Take care. We'll see you next week.